Good morning and welcome to the Madrona Group's 15-minute forms, where we pick a form to talk about for 15 minutes in hopes to develop a better understanding of the form itself and how to use it. Today, we're going to talk about Form 22AWO, the Appraisal Work Order Notice. So this form is a notice, and this notice is to be given if the property is subject to an appraisal and the appraisal came back with work orders demanded by the appraiser. This is not necessarily the same thing as having underwriting conditions. This is only if some things need to be done with the home itself in order for the appraiser to finish that appraisal and then claim it in as value. The form itself is just a very simple one-paragraph form, and it's a notice, so it is only signed by one party. The buyer would receive the appraisal, and then if there were work orders on the appraisal, the buyer could then send this over to the seller and have those work orders be addressed. Now, this is not an automatic responsibility for the seller to take care of. It is just a notice to the seller that the appraisal did come back with conditions required by the appraiser in order to actually complete that appraisal work. Now, if an appraisal is done and work orders are called out and the seller chooses not to complete that list of items, then the buyer may be protected under a financing contingency if they still have that in place with the appraisal provision. There are ways to waive this, so just keep in mind what the rest of your transaction looks like before you start sending over notices like this. You want to make sure that you do still have intact your appraisal provision of the financing contingency in order to initiate the conversation that this form creates. You would use this form if, say, the water heater wasn't strapped and that was called out, or perhaps there's something with deck railing that needs to be done. Anytime there's a condition to finalize the appraisal, you would use this form. The most important thing we need to keep in mind with this are what exactly are the timelines. So we go through the process of ordering appraisal. It comes back in, we've received the appraisal. If we remember last week, we talked about the timelines starting once we receive the appraisals. I'm going to talk about this in a buyer perspective because the buyer is going to be the one that receives the appraisal. So once the buyer receives the appraisal with the conditions listed, you'll have to actually thumb through and read the appraisal. These conditions are not something that is bullet pointed, lined out very specifically in a clear place to find them. You usually have to thumb through and read through the appraisal itself. And oftentimes they're written in a very, very small note at the bottom of one of the pages. If you need help looking at an appraisal to find out if there are conditions called out, please feel free to either reach out to a managing broker or you can ask the lender to help you review exactly what it says. So the timelines that we have to deliver the appraisal work or notice are going to be noted in Form 22A and Form 22. Anytime we have an appraisal provision, we will have it spelled out on the timelines. All of the language that you see in the pages of 22A on page 2 and 3 are going to give you all the timelines when it comes to the appraisal conversation and the delivery of those notices. Now, if you look at paragraph D right here, this is where it lines out exactly how much time is needed in order to deliver this. The buyer shall, within 3 days of receiving the appraisal work order, give notice to the seller. And you're going to need to attach a copy of that appraisal work order itself. Now, if the buyer is unable to obtain financing because these work order items are not complete, the buyer will be protected with their financing contingency. If the buyer does not deliver this work order notice and thus never lets the seller know that these work orders have been called out, the buyer will not be protected under this provision because in order to enact this provision, you need to give notice. If you're not using a financing contingency and instead just have an appraisal contingency, this work order provision is lined out in number 7 on Form 22A. Everything is consistent when it comes to delivery times and the purpose of this, but it is on paragraph 7 of the 22AA if you do not have a financing contingency and you're only using the appraisal addendum. Now, there are benefits in order to with this form. So If you have a buyer who is depending on financing, the benefit to your buyer is going to be that they will be able to close the sale. Everybody up to this transaction or this point in the transaction has gone through several changes, and we are usually nearing the end of our transaction. Sellers have put money into moving or repairs that were requested in the inspection, and buyers have spent money with the inspection contingency and they've paid for this appraisal. So the benefits of using this form are to help the completion of this sale. The cautions by using this is if an appraisal work order is delivered and work is actually called out, you're going to need to have a new negotiation on who's going to be doing that work, how that's going to look, and you're going to be putting pen to paper, drafting these provisions likely on a blank form. So if you're drafting provisions on a blank form, please use every caution that you would in any normal situation of drafting language. These items listed need to make sure that we have very clear and concise responsibilities of who's going to pay, what's going to be done, what happens if, then what. So make sure that if you are putting pen to paper, drafting something about these work orders, that you actually are doing so with the competence that's required by our job. I appreciate you listening today, and I hope you've been able to learn something new about the 22